Hi, I'm Amber Schrader, Executive Director of Badgers United, and you are listening to The Flagship, where we discuss what Wisconsin's flagship university needs to be successful. Today, we are joined by Senator André Jacque, who is from De Pere and represents Northeast Wisconsin. He has co-sponsored Representative Dave Murphy's bill addressing tuition rates, and most importantly, he is also a UW-Madison alumni. Thanks for joining us today, Senator.
My pleasure to be here, Amber.
So before we dive into some questions about the university, I want our listeners to get a chance to learn a little bit about you. You served in the Assembly and you're now in the Senate. Talk about some differences you see between the two.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is that you have a greater opportunity in the state Senate to impact in the policy environment, things that can actually get done. It's really the same people and the issues. It's so many things that are the same. I mean, the offices are pretty much the same size, and you have the same salary and everything else. Obviously, the Senate is 3 times the population, but I think outside of that, part of the way that you matter more is just with the smaller margin and the smaller numbers in the state Senate, it's a much more collaborative and open decision-making process, which is something that is kind of allowed when you have that smaller size and smaller caucuses that you're making decisions within.
That's really interesting. I feel comfortable saying you represent one of the most beautiful areas in Wisconsin. For folks who haven't been up to Northeast Wisconsin, tell us what they're missing.
Oh, absolutely. I really do feel like I'm blessed to represent the most beautiful part of the state. We have the best beach in the state, Neshota Beach and Trivers, but I represent portions of the Lake Shore, the Green Bay area, and the Fox Valley. It's a very scenic drive, and really I think the biggest thing is it's the nicest people that you'll ever meet. We really have all parts of the economy and all parts of urban and rural life represented within my district. So it really is a tremendous opportunity to be able to represent people as well as get to know what's important to them in just every single walk of life that you can imagine.
So as you're representing your constituents, what's the thing you're most proud of in your political career?
It's hard to pin it down to just one. There are really so many things. I think a lot of them might come down to just protecting victims, protecting people, especially to the extent that I'm able to tell people stories. And sometimes you have a very tragic situation where somebody's lost a loved one, son or daughter, a parent, and there's nothing that you can do to be able to bring that loved person back. But you can make the situation better for the next person. And so a lot of the work that I've done for victims of abuse, whether that's domestic violence or sexual assault, human trafficking, really some of the public safety issues that are addressed by treatment courts and additional public defenders, certainly assistant district attorneys. But I've done a lot of work in areas, too, in terms of employment and helping young people set themselves up for success, individuals with disabilities to be able to take on additional work. A lot of stuff in local government, because that was my background when I worked for the city of Green Bay before being elected. But, I think it really comes down to I'm just the most proud to be able to look myself in the mirror and know that I'm doing everything that I can to stand up for the people that sent me here and to tell their stories and really try to make government make a little bit more common sense.
Well, that's quite an impressive record. You, like me, are a UW-Madison alum. When you were looking at colleges, why did you pick UW-Madison?
Well, my sister was already at UW-Madison. It certainly was well aware of the academic reputation, was looking to stay, relatively close to home, be close to my family. I had looked at some schools out east. I think Northwestern was the only other school that I actually applied to. But I was in the Medical Scholars Program when I first enrolled, and certainly medicine was an interest that I had, more so in terms of research than being a general practitioner. Politics and public affairs was supposed to be more of a hobby or a sidelight, and obviously I found a lot of success with that and decided to stay more in that vein. But there just were a lot of opportunities, and certainly having that political interest as well, being in the state's capital city, there were a whole lot of avenues that were available to me being on campus.
So you mentioned the Capitol. Let's jump into what's happening in the Capitol today. You have co-sponsored a bill with Representative Dave Murphy to talk about tuition flexibility. Why is now the right time for that discussion?
Yeah, and this is really a concept that Representative Murphy and I had talked about in previous sessions. I think it's important to have guidelines. It's important to have certainty, especially when you're talking about long-term planning for higher education, for students, for anything. And I think the opportunity to have that discussion in advance of the budget process, where it's very high stakes. It's the one bill that has to pass, and things move extremely quickly. So to be able to take a step back and say, this is what it should look like, it just gives, I think, hopefully people more of an opportunity to have some confidence in the way things would happen, as opposed to kind of the fits and starts that we've seen before, when you have changes in maybe political administrations and the composition of the board. And, really there have been times where there have been rather significant tuition hikes in a relatively short time frame. And I think a lot of people recognize that people aren't best served by that. I know that's always kind of a frustration that, that I had as a student, when you saw tuition even used as kind of an escape valve for students who were many times still having to pay those bills that didn't come from an advantageous financial situation. So I think it's something that the more we can try to take a long view in terms of just what those obligations and responsibilities are going to be for students and their families in affording the opportunities that UW-Madison and higher education gives them. So I think we want to be proactive versus reactive. And that's one of the things that I think this bill can help facilitate the conversation for.
So can you talk about how this bill provides predictability both for students and for the university?
Sure. So, it basically introduces the concept of cohort tuition, which is basically that there is going to be predictable tuition from the point that you would enter at UW to the point that you end, at least to the extent that you stay on time with graduation, or at least for the first 4 years that you would be enrolled. So it certainly offers that predictability for students. At the same time, for the system, you at least have, again, some ideas, some guidelines for what the sort of revenue is that could be raised, depending on what else might occur through the budget process. But it's something that, again, talks about what I think are reasonable limitations on based on inflation and everything else to keep it affordable, because I do think we have an incredible value certainly across the UW system, but especially at UW-Madison, based on its reputation, the fact that certainly when I was a student, and now that's getting further and further in the rearview mirror, but it is something where we want to make sure that we do keep it a great value for our students.
So we agree. Do you feel there's political will to act on this legislation at this time?
Well, I hope so. Obviously, we haven't been successful in getting a hearing at this point. It is something that we've talked a little bit about with the chairs of the respective committees. We do have 11 co-sponsors. Now, they're all Republicans, so all of the majority party in the legislature. So that's actually a positive, given some of the rhetoric that has occurred on this legislation. And so I was actually pleased, because there are a lot of bills that are introduced with a lot less than that. And this isn't necessarily something that a special interest group or folks are necessarily steering legislators to agree with. It's something that makes sense to them based on the information that we've been able to provide and respond to the misinformation that's been out there. I certainly am disappointed to the extent that there have been attacks from some of my Democratic colleagues, and even one political group on the left, that are basically trying to say that we're racing to raise tuition, or trying to make some political hay out of something that wouldn't be politically popular, which is that we are essentially looking to make college less affordable. When in fact, it's the opposite. We're trying to make sure that we're able to, again, we're not talking free college here. We're talking about something that is going to have a manageable, particularly when you're talking about something like cohort tuition, a plannable process for how to get to where people want to go. And it does make the conversation more difficult, but hopefully as we have more of that conversation, particularly if we're able to get public hearings and head into the next budget process, it's something that we'll be able to sit down and have a more detached and reasonable conversation about. So I certainly hope that there will be additional opportunities this session.
How can groups like Badgers United help support your desire to move this piece of legislation forward?
I think the extent to which it can just be communicated to the public and certainly to alumni that this is a reasonable approach. This is something that should be bipartisan in terms of, again, placing limitations on how much tuition can rise, but at the same time allowing for that planning process to take place. It's not saying that there's going to necessarily be a need to raise tuition. I think you always want to, in any budgeting process, look at existing expenditures and how to move things around on the balance sheet. But it is something where what we're hopefully avoiding is the extremes, the pendulum swings that, I believe the last time that you had a tuition freeze that was eliminated, it jumped to a 60% increase in a very short time frame. And that is something that dramatically impacts people's ability to plan their future and requires taking on a much higher debt load than what people otherwise would have anticipated. So that's certainly something that's very important to me. I actually used to serve as the UW system representative on the Higher Education Aids Board. I worked my way through college and had a number of scholarships as well. So I came through college in the black. That was still achievable at the time. It's probably less achievable now, but it is something that I think as we look at this bill, the goal with the bill, again, is not to be talking about raising costs for students or their families. It's about having that dependability and sustainability and planning process at a point where higher education, is transforming. We do have demographic shifts and, people's post-secondary educational options are changing. There's certainly, I think, a very positive trend that we've had from our K-12 system in terms of dual enrollment and being able to have students start their post-secondary period with more college credits, and I think that's fantastic. That was really something that I had the opportunity to benefit a lot from. It certainly helped me when I started at UW-Madison. I actually had mid-junior standing out of high school from Green Bay Southwest, and that was something that probably wasn't as common at that time. I don't think that the technical college that was just down the street really had any joint classes with us at that time. I took a course over at UW-GB, but that's something that I think folks around the state from all of our four-year campuses, all of our tech colleges, are looking at how do we set students up for success and give them the ability to prove their competency, but also have a maximum of opportunities to focus on what they really want to get into once they get to that next level. And certainly we have a wide variety of very specialized, very high-quality instruction at our UW schools, particularly our flagship school.
One thing you said I think is important to go back to, the pendulum swing being hard for students. It's also hard on UW-Madison. It's hard to plan for your future when you don't know what your revenue is going to do. I think that's something that we miss in this conversation often.
Yeah, I think that it certainly, across government there always is, at different levels of government as well. Circumstances come in that you don't have control over, and you have to adjust to them. And so it's certainly something that I think there's a lot of benefits to the legislation.
So we've talked a lot about the tuition challenges. What other challenges do you see facing UW-Madison?
Well, largely beating Minnesota and Ohio State yet.
Yeah, that's an upcoming one.
And hopefully getting that chance in the Big Ten title game. No, obviously, reputation can be something that the university has to overcome. I mean, I think, when you have a large university, sometimes you're held responsible for the actions of each of your different components, each of your members, and sometimes there's stories that aren't always the most positive. So it's a matter of keeping that public confidence, and that's something that I think is important to keep in mind for all levels of government. So that and the constant change. I mean, and really the challenges that I just mentioned in terms of demographics and the fact that we have just like in the workforce, we have more people leaving the workforce than are entering it on a daily basis. we're heading into that demographic winter by the midpoint of this coming decade in terms of just a dramatic reduction in students that are actually going to college at the higher level, and that's going to certainly have a major impact in what college looks like on campuses.
So another challenge in the Capitol is certainly the divided government. Do you see any common ground for Senator Fitzgerald, Representative Voss, and Governor Evers to work together on higher education?
Well, certainly there's always going to be common ground that can be found. I can't speak to whether or not they'll ever get there or what the level of trust or confidence is to even start to have those conversations right now. I think a lot of what I do as a legislator is putting ideas out there and starting those conversations. And I always kind of look at politics as the art of the possible. And clearly, there's a wide range of policy. There's just a broad spectrum of possible policy outcomes that you can arrive at. It's all about whether or not you can actually have a positive enough process to get there. So, as far as the rest of this session, I think things are going to probably look different next session, and there's always But do I see areas of common ground? Yes, absolutely.
So you mentioned this. Senator Fitzgerald is running for U.S. Congress in a seat he's likely to win in 2020. How do you think that will change the Wisconsin State Senate landscape?
Well, I do think that Senator Fitzgerald is very likely to win that seat. Of course, another one of my colleagues, Senator Tiffany, is running for an open seat in a special election in northern Wisconsin, and there's probably going to be a few other new faces in the Senate as well. So, and the Senate is going to be more dependent on the personalities of the people sitting in the seats versus the Assembly has had and is likely to continue to have a larger majority simply because they have 3 times the number of seats. So even if you have percentage-wise similar margins, it just, the addition or subtraction of a few people has a pretty significant impact in the state Senate, and who that next leader is going to play a significant role in what the posture of the legislature, at least the state Senate, is going to be towards a number of issues. Speaker Voss is also, from what I've heard, quite possibly looking to leave in the next cycle or two, and that would be a fairly dramatic change as well in the Assembly, depending on who is in a position there. So, and again, that might not be the case, and anything can happen in terms of who might stick around in the state Senate, but things can be extremely personality driven in in government in general, in both the executive and the legislative branch. So I don't have a crystal ball to say exactly what those impacts are going to be, but it certainly is going to change.
So our organization, Badgers United, spends a lot of time working on misconceptions across the state about UW-Madison. Knowing there's going to be some shifts with the 2020 election, what should we be focusing our messages on?
I think people have to understand that we do have an excellent university system, and we have an excellent flagship university in UW-Madison. I think one of the things that I really found when I came to campus is that campus is not as big as the numbers would indicate. And certainly it is still a large campus, both in terms of number of students as well as geographic area, but it also is very connected, and there is a sense of community, and there is an ability to have that fellowship with your fellow students, with faculty, that, it really is, I don't want to say a small town feel, but it's not this, this idea that is sometimes put out there as far as you're just a name and a barcode. This is something where there's a lot of opportunities. You can find just about anything that you're passionate about on the UW-Madison campus and have a chance to throw yourself into it. So it's not just liberal arts, even though those obviously get a lot of attention, and a lot of individual things might get a lot of attention, or even cause some issues like what I talked about before. But I think another thing is just within the University of Wisconsin system. And of course, we're looking at a new chancellor with Ray Cross retiring. But, there is sometimes an envy that crops up between the other four-year institutions and UW-Madison as the flagship school, and that's certainly something that I've heard before. I know that one of the areas in the past there were some flexibilities that were proposed for UW-Madison that would separate itself a little bit from what is available to the rest of the UW system, or just things that treated UW-Madison a little bit differently. And there was a very strong pushback against that by leadership at the other UW schools that I certainly heard from directly. So, I think the extent to which we can just make sure that we have positive relationships between the UW and the tech college system, as well as UW and its fellow four-year UW institutions.
Great. So one last question while we have you here. There's been discussions that crop up every once in a while about more flexibility for UW-Madison. Mike Knetter recently spoke at an event for Badgers United and compared talked about the athletics department and how when it was deregulated, it flourished into the program that it is today. What is your perspective on regulations in higher ed?
It's going to be a nuanced thing because there's always going to be individual circumstances that require a little different thought process. It was proposed in the budget a few years back about giving some additional flexibility that was requested, and I think I was generally pretty supportive of that. Obviously, it didn't end up happening, but there are also things like the athlete agent bill that I put forward with Representative Brooks that goes off the Uniform Law Commission, really in concert with the NCAA, and something that I know that I believe Barry Alvarez has been very supportive of, but trying to make sure that student athletes aren't preyed upon by some bad actors. And that is something where regulations exist for a reason. Certainly, there are also situations that occur with whether that's within the Big Ten or just across the country, where there are some states that have very different circumstances that they operate under, and those are pluses and minuses. I mean, just like in economic development, you have areas that compete against each other based on incentives, but then there are also larger scale things like workforce or infrastructure that's already in place that kind of tip the scales. But the UW is a creature of the state, just like local governments are. Your counties, your local governments that then flow from that as well. So, I think we have to, on an individual basis, and certainly I've talked with UW employees as well that have asked for specific flexibilities in regards to purchasing or just different ways of doing things that we have, maybe a good roadmap on how they've worked somewhere else. So, I think we'll continue to take a look at those things, and that probably is within that realm of the common ground that was referenced earlier in terms of things that could be looked at that aren't partisan or at least contentious within the parties.
Senator, we've covered a lot of topics here today. Is there anything we missed that you'd like to address?
No, I think this is a great conversation. I certainly look back very fondly about my times on campus. I had an opportunity to attend UW as both a undergraduate and graduate student. Enjoy the relationships that I still have with not only students that have interned there that have come over here, but the faculty as well. And I just appreciate the opportunity to continue these conversations.
Well, it's been great talking to a fellow UW alumni. We appreciate your time here today.
Thank you very much, Amber.
This has been an episode of Badgers United Podcast, The Flagship, where we work with thought leaders in higher education to make sense of the complex policy web that governs our state's largest university. Please follow us on Twitter at Badgers_United, sign up for our mailing list on our website at badgersunited.org, and subscribe to The Flagship wherever you get your podcasts.